Buonasera. Buonasera e benvenuti a questa celebrazione del lavoro di professor Althann per il libro di Giobbe. E adesso, per dire il benvenuto, do la parola al nostro presidente, professor Dubovský.
Buonasera a tutti e grazie che siete venuti a questo evento molto speciale. E grazie Robert per arrivare a questa bellissima conclusione. Ciò che vorrei dire è che l'Istituto Biblico vive grazie alle persone che sono qui, che hanno dedicato praticamente la loro vita a un lavoro enorme. Se voi pensate, dietro questo libro sono 30 anni di lavoro, 30 anni di pazienza, perseveranza, umiltà che Robert Althann incarna. Robert, nel nome dell'istituto, ma anche nel nome mio come il tuo ex studente, vorrei veramente ringraziarti per il lavoro che hai fatto per il biblico e anche per la scienza biblica. Grazie veramente.
Bene, procediamo così, voi conoscete tutti questi quattro molto bene. Professor Gianto parlerà titolo Robert Althann Between Philology and Textual Criticism. Paola Mollo, la BHQ di Giobbe e lo studio di ebraico. Professor Pessoa, the Septuagint in the BHQ volumes of Job, and Professor Soo Hoo, the BHQ Job in the context of ancient Near Eastern texts. Each one of them has 15 minutes, so I'll be standing up and yelling at 15-minute point to tell them time's up. But yes, thank you for accepting this invitation to celebrate this volume. Professor Gianto, to you.
Thank you very much, Greg, for this opportunity. And this would be just an appreciation to you and to your work, to your friendship, and to your being here some years ago. So the title is Robert Althann Between Philology and Textual Criticism. I hope this will characterize his research interests and his special talents. What do I understand with philology? Philology analyzes the structure of language in its historical context and its connection to related languages. Professor Althann approaches Biblical Hebrew on its own terms, but also in comparison to other Northwest Semitic languages, especially these languages. As for textual criticism, it seeks to determine the original wording of a text based on its available written witnesses. The BHQ of Job is a critical edition of the so-called Leningrad Codex in light of direct or indirect witnesses from pre-Masoretic biblical texts and ancient versions in Greek, Latin, Syriac, and Aramaic. Althann's philological analysis of Jeremiah, and now I have to move to another kind of thing. The first book there, Philological Analysis of Jeremiah 4-6 in the light of Northwest Semitic, Biblica et Orientalia 38, Rome 1983, is the slightly revised form of his doctoral thesis defended in 1979 at the University of Zimbabwe. This study, supervised by the theologian T.A. Burkill, was in fact conducted within the framework of the influential philological approach to the Old Testament books pioneered by Mitchell de Hood here at the Biblical. The monograph also clearly shows the author's interest in engaging with ancient versions. This dual focus on philology and textual criticism would continue to characterize his later work. In 1991, Robert joined the Biblical Institute, offering courses on the exegesis of Job and Psalms, and later Hebrew and Biblical Aramaic. In 1993, He accepted an invitation to join the BHQ project for the Book of Job, and today we see the fruits of that labor. While teaching, supervising dissertations, and preparing the Job edition, Robert published Studies in Northwest Semitic, Biblica Orientalia 45, the year 97. This work gives importance to both philology and textual criticism. In addition to these three books, Robert has authored a long list of articles and reviews in various biblical journals. Not to mention his valuable service to scholarship by compiling the Elencos of Biblica, which gathered publication in biblical studies between 1996 to 2011. I hope I'm right. Allow me now to show Robert's academic genealogy. Now, this is familiar to us. Robert Althann, he was here from 91 to Emeritus 2009. But he is connected to this person, Mitchell Dehood, 92-82. He had a career here until his death, premature death, in the year 1982. But this person, Mitchell, was a direct student of this character, William Albright, the Johns Hopkins University 27 to his emeritus. And not only that, Albright goes back to this famous person, Paul Haupt. He was the German scholar who was implanted to the United States. And he had a career in Germany and then in the United States at the Johns Hopkins. But the larger family group would go into also this person, William Morin. He was teaching here from 58 last century to 1966, and then he moved to Harvard. Well, because of that, you have this person. Emeritus, so pretty. But the story will continue somewhat. There is some connection between Mitch Dehood and myself, and this would be something interesting. Well, actually, we were friends. We would go to opera, we'd go to theater and restaurants. Technically, I'm his successor here, but in the field, I was a bit different. But all of us here, we are all in the family, so we are cousins. We go back to this person, the Leipzig School of Semitics and Assyriology, by that name, Friedrich Delitz. That was not the clerical color, but the habit of the gentleman of those years. He was known in the expression Babel und Bibel. Well, none of us would go into that anymore, but he would be our great-great-grandfather. Okay. At our first general meeting in 1933, I mean the BHQ team meeting, where each editor presented a sample of our work, the late lead editor of the BHQ, Richard Weiss, he died in the year 2020, I think, yes, noted that Robert skillfully balanced philology and textual issues. And this is evident in his finished work. And I will give an example. This is his treatment on the interesting word Talmavet. Let darkness and death shadow, some people would say shadow of death, contaminate or claim it. The BHQ apparatus, the dilemma is like that. GV and S between parentheses and T also between parentheses. This is an elegant statement. The elegant apparatus tells us that the lemma is witnessed by the Septuagint and Vulgate, also by the Peshitta and the Targum, though with some variation. The symbol at the end of the apparatus means there is a textual note to the apparatus. Allow me to rephrase the note showing how Althann handles philology and textual variation. The note starts with these words, quote, "The problem with Talmawet is more philological than textual, and is briefly mentioned in the edition only because there has been a long discussion of the word and its place in editions of the text over the centuries." End of quote. Now, as observed by Robert, according to some scholars, the Masoretic vocalization of that particular word implies that the form is a compound noun based on popular etymology, that is, reading the consonantal Talmawet as consisting of the words for darkness and death. This has become a staple in the philological discussion of that word. In my view, though, it is not altogether clear, and Robert would share this, I hope, if the ancient versions reflect such a compound. The textual evidence warrants this doubt. Let us look at them. The Septuagint says scia thanato, and the Latin umbra mortis. Certainly, these two versions understand the Hebrew as construct chains rather than compound. Likewise, Syriac, talalay malta, and Targum tolemote. But in these versions, the word for the shadow is in plural construct. That is why I think they are labeled by Robert as variations. I suspect that these two versions, the Syriac and the Targum, they may have read that word. So the plural of shadows, the shadows of evening. Compound nouns are rare in Hebrew, as Althann notes. And for that reason, some scholars think that the original reading may have been Talmud, gloom, an abstract noun, Talmud, from root Tzelema, to second according to lexicon. Though not clear attested in Hebrew, this root is attested in the cognate languages. Earlier in his 1997 book, though not mentioned in the note, Althann gives a fuller discussion on the scholarly discussions of the word. I think he didn't quote himself out of modesty. What can be said of the semantic ambiguity generated by the writing like that, Talmawet or Talmud? In my view, the ambiguity is to be considered part of the meaning of the text. And in a literary composition like the Book of Job, the two readings, Talmawet, terrible shadow, and Talmud, gloom, are not mutually exclusive. They are part of the meaning and richness of a literary text. I detected such a sensitivity in Althann's treatment of a complicated textual case involving also other lemma. And I hope I have given my appreciation to this achievement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gianto, for this very warm presentation of both of your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and all of us are the heirs here in this room of this great tradition of scholarship. So we are now to Professoressa Mollo. A te la parola.
Ecco, buonasera a tutti. Grazie per l'invito, presenterò in italiano, se non è un problema. Innanzitutto vorrei ringraziare chi ha organizzato questo evento e soprattutto l'autore di quest'opera, importantissima. Preparare un piccolo contributo per questa presentazione mi ha dato la possibilità di fermarmi un po' e riflettere sull'impiego che noi come studenti e come studiosi facciamo degli strumenti. Quello che vorrei fare perciò semplicemente condividere questa riflessione che ho fatto sugli strumenti. Mi trovo in un'aula e in un tavolo in cui ci sono persone che da anni lavorano a edizioni critiche di questo tipo, per cui ne parlerò da utente finale, diciamo, non con l'expertise dei colleghi. Un'edizione critica come la BHQ fornisce a chi la utilizza, rispetto alle altre edizioni in commercio, una completa e preziosa informazione riguardante le versioni antiche, innanzitutto. Poi fornisce in apparato, in maniera consistente, una possibile spiegazione delle varianti, a seconda della valutazione individuale dell'editore. Fornisce un commentario di critica testuale approfondito per i casi più rilevanti, nonché, come sapete, la Massora Magna e quella parva, sia nel testo sia nei brevi commentari al fondo che sciolgono le abbreviazioni rendendole accessibili a tutti. Sembra scontato dirlo, ma l'edizione critica è il punto di partenza per chiunque studi un testo. Possiamo dire che è il testo presentato nella sua veste problematica. Propone un testo concreto, storico, materiale, ovviamente nel caso di un'edizione diplomatica, come la BHQ, ma allo stesso tempo ne mette in discussione l'unicità e l'univocità. Offre, si può dire, la fotografia sincronica del testo in un dato momento della sua storia compositiva e testuale, trasmissione testuale, ma allo stesso tempo ne proietta come un'ombra sul muro il profilo diacronico, guidando certamente l'utente nella lettura della possibile storia del testo, ma lasciando sostanzialmente a ciascuno la responsabilità finale dell'interpretazione. Ecco, come persona che si interessa nello specifico della lingua ebraica, mi sono domandata in che cosa e come sia rilevante un'edizione critica, un'edizione come questa, per lo studio della lingua. Questa era un po' la mia domanda di partenza. Infatti noi abbiamo, per studiare la lingua, gli strumenti, abbiamo le grammatiche, abbiamo i dizionari. Potremmo chiederci a cosa ci serve un'edizione critica per studiare la lingua, per conoscere meglio la lingua. Innanzitutto, anche questo è scontato, ma l'edizione del testo, ossia il testo, è fondamentale, perché se non ci fosse il testo non ci sarebbe grammatica, non ci sarebbe lingua, per cui è proprio la partenza per la conoscenza di base della lingua. La lingua è parte del testo, anzi la lingua è nel testo. Possiamo conoscere a memoria tutti i fenomeni fonetici, la morfologia delle coniugazioni verbali, tutto il vocabolario al fondo della nostra grammatica, eppure ogni volta che apriamo una pagina di un testo biblico ci troviamo sempre un po' possibilmente spiazzati, sorpresi, talvolta scomodi. Troviamo magari una costruzione che ci sembra insolita, una forma che ci suona come irregolare o l'uso di una parola che ha un significato diverso in quel contesto rispetto al solito o a quello che conosciamo. Esattamente come quando, parlando con una nuova persona, dobbiamo confrontarci con le sue competenze linguistiche, con il suo sostrato, magari il suo accento, il suo modo personale di esprimersi, la tematica, il coinvolgimento della persona rispetto alla tematica, lo stile, eccetera. Per cui metterci di fronte al testo è il modo in realtà più avanzato che abbiamo per conoscere, per imparare la lingua nel suo uso, ossia in definitiva per imparare la lingua vera. Mi sono riproposta allora di sfruttare un esempio piuttosto noto all'interno del libro di Giobbe, su cui si è scritto tanto, e provare a ripercorrerlo a partire dall'utilizzo dell'edizione della BHQ, per capire quali chiavi ulteriori questa edizione fornisca all'utente per una possibile interpretazione. È solamente un esempio, ovviamente fra i moltissimi che si potrebbero fare, mi serve più che altro per un'illustrazione di alcuni punti di metodo. È noto che nel prologo narrativo del libro di Giobbe, perciò capitoli 1 e 2, per 4 volte il verbo barach al piel, berach, benedire, viene usato, sembra, con il senso di maledire. Come possiamo vedere dalla slide, le principali edizioni moderne, le principali traduzioni moderne traducono queste 4 ricorrenze di Berach come maledire. Qui ho citato la CEI, ma si potrebbero citare anche l'ARSV, TOB, eccetera. Tendenzialmente vengono tradotte con questa accezione o di maledire, di rinnegare qualche altra volta. Infatti, se vediamo questi passi, se riconosciamo un po' questi passi, in che senso benedire Dio dovrebbe essere un peccato da purificare, versetto 1,5, oppure addirittura un peccato mortale al versetto 2,9. E perché mai nei versetti più o meno simili, 1,11 e 2,5, Giobbe dovrebbe benedire apertamente, benedire in faccia a Dio, se questo lo privasse di tutto ciò che possiede, e compresa anche la sua salute? È ovvio che in questi casi il verbo viene usato in modo atipico rispetto a quello che conosciamo nella Bibbia. Tale uso lo troviamo soltanto in questa parte del libro di Giobbe e in una circostanza diversa anche in 1 Re 21, 10, 13, ossia nella storia della vigna di Nabot. Questo problema ha sollevato e solleva sostanzialmente 2 tipi di domande. Innanzitutto, perché viene scelto un verbo come benedire quando probabilmente si vuole intendere il suo opposto, maledire? E inoltre, chi ha effettuato questa scelta? Si tratta dell'autore, perciò è una scelta che possiamo definire originale, oppure di uno scriba sensibile alla tematica della blasfemia che ha scelto di affievolire successivamente l'espressione attraverso una correzione che possiamo dire secondaria? La BHS, per esempio, in questi 4 loci non prende una posizione, sostenendo che si può trattare o di un uso eufemistico originale di barach al piel, al posto ad esempio di killel o di altri verbi simili che significano maledire, oppure, altra alternativa, che si tratti di una sostituzione secondaria, una correzione. Altri strumenti però non vengono forniti all'utente. La BHQ invece in questa versione, che sistematicamente fornisce le proposte di traduzione delle versioni antiche, offre all'utente il colpo d'occhio sulla resa antica di questi passi. Come possiamo vedere, da un lato vi è un comportamento costante della Vulgata e di Aquila nel tradurre come benedire, per cui, se vogliamo letteralmente o secondo il testo masoretico. Dall'altro polo opposto vi è un comportamento costante del siriaco nel tradurre come maledire, e a metà si trova un comportamento incostante del Targum e soprattutto del greco nel tradurre alcune ricorrenze come benedire e altre ricorrenze come maledire. Tale alternanza solleva innanzitutto la domanda: le versioni antiche stanno leggendo nella loro forlaghe un verso che in ebraico significa maledire, come sembrerebbero fare il siriaco e il Targum, oppure stanno facendo un'opera di interpretazione, trasformando in alcuni casi un originario berach in un equivalente che significa maledire? Il caso del greco è abbastanza chiarificatore. Infatti, nel caso in cui la 70 si distanzia dal testo masoretico, versetto 1,5, lo fa comunque presupponendo il lessem ebraico berach, interpretandolo secondo il proprio sentire. Infatti, in 1,5 la 70 traduce il testo masoretico. Il testo masoretico dice: forse essi hanno benedetto Dio nel loro cuore, usa il verbo barach al piel, con forse essi hanno fatto cattivi pensieri contro Dio. Kakà e Nenoesan. Come nota anche McCarthy, in questo caso l'espressione Kakà e Nenoesan può soltanto essere una resa a partire da barach, benedire, interpretato come eufemismo nel testo ebraico, e non può essere una resa o una parafrasi di un originale killel, per esempio, maledire o simili. Seguendo questa pista, sono molti perciò i commentatori che ritengono che la forlaghe di tutte le versioni antiche sia sempre la radice ebraica barach, e che esso sia talvolta tradotto letteralmente, talvolta invece interpretato all'interno del contesto. Un piccolo dubbio lo riserva comunque, ad esempio, il commentario critico di Barthélemy, che attribuisce una valutazione B alla lezione del testo masoretico. Si riserva appunto questo dubbio. Trovati per cui nelle versioni antiche alcuni criteri possibili per sostenere l'originalità di barach nel testo masoretico, grazie proprio alla consultazione dell'edizione critica, che in un colpo d'occhio comunque ci offre questa comparazione, Si può tornare allora alla domanda iniziale del perché sia stata scelta proprio questa parola. Allora, benedire, se in fondo il contesto suggerirebbe l'opposto, maledire. E qui ci sono in generale due possibili tendenze interpretative. La prima è pensare che sia stata preferita l'espressione benedire Dio per non pronunciare, come fosse un tabù, la pratica opposta, ossia quella di maledirlo, pratica talmente blasfema da non poter nemmeno essere menzionata. Tale tendenza è predominante nella critica e nelle traduzioni moderne, che interpretano queste ricorrenze di Baruch per cui come eufemismo per un verbo di maledire, e così in questo modo, secondo questa tendenza, traducono come maledire, per cui interpretano l'ebraico avere omesso, avere evitato di dire la parola maledire. Vi è poi un'altra tendenza, ossia quella di pensare che queste ricorrenze di Baruch significano effettivamente benedire e che sia il contesto pragmatico, ossia chi pronuncia la frase, con quale intenzione, in quale contesto, rivolgendosi a chi, per cui sia il contesto pragmatico, la pragmatica del testo, ad essere decisiva per interpretare opportunamente il senso, per cui un'argomentazione di tipo più linguistica. Infatti, se lette in quest'ottica, un'ottica ironica, o meglio ancora antifrastica, ossia dire il contrario di ciò che si pensa, tali ricorrenze potrebbero essere intese come benedire, pronunciate però con forza illocutiva opposta rispetto al loro senso letterale. Questo vale soprattutto, direi, per la seconda e la terza ricorrenza, quelle che sono in bocca al provocatore Satan, versetto 1.11 e 2.5, che sfida Dio a mandare ogni male contro Giobbe per dimostrargli come quest'ultimo smetterebbe di benedirlo. Toccalo nella sua carne e vedrai come ti benedirà, questo senso. Eventualmente si presta bene anche per il discorso della moglie, il versetto 2.9, che troviamo tra l'altro nella 70 prolungato con un'aggiunta midrashica interessante. La moglie probabilmente si potrebbe intendere che sta ironizzando, rimproverando il marito, sul fatto che Giobbe continui a benedire Dio e nonostante ciò che morirà lo stesso. Per cui continua pure nella tua integrità, benedici Dio e muori lo stesso. Letti in ottica ironica. Questo piccolo esempio vuole soltanto illustrare come ogni considerazione di tipo interpretativo, diciamo il processo finale che si fa, che fonda le sue basi nella conoscenza della lingua e soprattutto della lingua nel suo uso, ossia nel testo, necessita di un'edizione del testo abbastanza informativa da fornire tutti i dati necessari per costruire di nuovo il senso. E in caso di corruttela del testo che ne dichiari apertamente i limiti. Un'edizione critica ottimale è proprio quella che fornisce agli utenti gli ingredienti e gli utensili necessari e migliori e anche le istruzioni per usarli. La responsabilità poi passa a chi si mette all'opera, che risponderà delle procedure e del risultato finale. Grazie ancora per questo preziosissimo lavoro, davvero.
Grazie. Thank you, Professoressa Mollo, for this deep dive and a new reflection on this very, very interesting question of how Job is using that verb, barach. So now we pass to Professor Pessoa, and he will be speaking about the Septuagint and the use of the Septuagint in the apparatus of the BHQ.
Okay. So good evening to everybody. I also would like to start with my congratulations to Robert Althann for this achievement. And I'll be talking a bit about the Septuagint in the BHQ volume of Job. I will briefly explain the general approach of the BHQ concerning the Septuagint, then the peculiarities of the Septuagint of Job, just a few strokes, and the challenges it brings to the editor preparing this kind of work. And I will show a couple of examples in this spirit of celebrating the work of Robert Althann. So concerning the general principles of the BHQ for the treatment of the Septuagint, the first aspect of the problem is to remember that it is a critical edition of the Hebrew text, not an edition of the Greek. Therefore, many Greek readings and Greek variants are not supposed to be in the apparatus. The Septuagint is among the so-called consistently cited witnesses. This means that every time you have an apparatus note in the BHQ, you see the Septuagint being quoted. But that's not always the case, but almost always. And the Septuagint is used because of its potential as evidence of independent knowledge of a Hebrew text. Given the scarcity of sources for Hebrew readings in the period we are interested, the Second Temple period, the Septuagint is one of the main sources of potential Hebrew variants. That's how and why it is often used in our edition of the BHQ. Therefore, it is important as indirect witness to Hebrew readings distinct from MT. The editor is often uncertain that it is the case. That's why the guidelines speak about arguably. So if it's arguable that the Greek reading goes back to a different Vorlage, even if the editor himself or herself is not convinced, that can be quoted in the apparatus as a potential indication of a Hebrew reading. And as Professor Mollo said, the evidence is presented in a way that the user can draw his or her own conclusion. So the editor has an opinion, he studied the problem, he will give you his evaluation, but the elements are there for the user's evaluation. The inclusion in the apparatus also requires that the reading is potentially of significance for translation or interpretation. This is, I will remind you that the BHQ is not an editio maior, it's not intended to be complete 100%. So there is another filter. The reading goes in the apparatus if it is potentially of significance for translation or interpretation. If the variant is self-evidently translational, the case should be excluded from the apparatus. This is more or less a consequence of what I said before. We're interested in Hebrew readings. If it is the work of the translator, if it's clearly the work of the translator, that wouldn't have a claim to be in the apparatus. That's why I added here this image of a book, a monograph on translation technique of the Greek job, because the research keeps going, keeps moving on about what the translator is doing and how. And this, of course, changes the way we see things. Therefore, the editor's understanding of the relationship of the Septuagint with its Vorlage is decisive for the work. As I just said, all this depends on the understanding of the translation techniques of the versions. Here we're talking about the Septuagint, but as you see, every book in the Septuagint has its own peculiarities. It's not the same translator, so the translators are working with a different set of principles and ideas. For Job, for example, the majority of scholars thinks that the Greek translator is among the freest of the LXX translators. So it is a very special situation because not many Septuagint books has this kind of approach. The translator most often did not have this kind of approach. The translator of Job was compared to the translator of Proverbs. In the research, it has been asked whether they are the same translator, and I added here a recent, the image of a recent monograph discussing this very problem. Beekman arrives at the conclusion that they are not the same translator, but they share many techniques, and they might belong to the same milieu, but they are not the same translator. That's his idea in his monograph. The translator of Job alternates between literal and free renderings. I know that literal is a very difficult thing to define. We have to see literal in which sense you're talking about literalness. But the interesting thing about Job is how he switches to a very free rendering. It's just translating sometimes the meaning of the column. He's not following word for word, as some other Septuagint translators do. There's a tendency to paraphrase. He likes to diversify the vocabulary, and that makes a big problem for an editor of a volume like the BHQ. Because if the translator or tends to reproduce with one Greek word the same Hebrew word every time or often, that makes life easier. If he likes to change things, now what exactly was he reading? So this makes a big problem. And I stress this because Robert Althann had a real problem in his hand to deal with this. So we really should thank him for all the effort and time invested dealing with these problems. For the Septuagint of Job, we have the Göttingen volume, edited by Ziegler and published in 1982. That is the G in apparatus of the BHQ, the standard collation edition for the Septuagint is the Göttingen volume. The Septuagint is shorter than the MT by 1/6, so we have a shorter translation. That's also a source of problems. However, there are some pluses, and I will show you one example today that I find interesting. It is said that the translator had an excellent knowledge of both Hebrew and Greek, so we're dealing with a competent translator. So I mentioned that the Septuagint is shorter than the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text. But then we have the exemplaric text in the majority of the witnesses, complementing the text, adding text to match the longer MT, often with material taken from Theodotion. These additions are indicated in the apparatus with G ast for asterisk, the asterisked materials in Job. Okay, this is not very important. The Coptic Sahidic is considered a good witness to the OG, and there is also the Lucianic text in Job. All these things become the kind of problem the editor has to deal with while dealing with the Septuagint. I would like to show a couple of examples of how Robert Althann presents the problems to the user of the edition, and the kind of question that the edition opens for research and for the exegete. So we have here Job 1:6. I'll read directly the English translation. One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and so on and so forth. So we have the expression B'nei Elohim in the Masoretic text, but then the Septuagint does not render here huioi to theu, as would be the more literal rendering that we find in other places in the Bible. The Septuagint reads hoi angeloi to theu, the angels of God. So what's happening here? Of course, the translator would have no difficulty in translating this literally, but what's going on here? So this is the apparatus, B'nei Elohim, with the versions that are aligned with the MT, and then hoi angeloi to theu for the Septuagint, read as interpreted by Robert Althann, characterized as an exegetical reading. So he comments, so there is a textual commentary for this case, we see here. And G appears to be avoiding a translation that might be taken to imply polytheism. So here is where we try to understand that the translator sometimes did not only do his job of, rendering the same meaning, he's worried about something else, theology. Here, the expression could imply the notion of a divine council gathering before God. It is a notion that is widespread in the ancient Near East. There is an expert here that can tell me that if I'm wrong, but seems that the translator wanted to avoid this. This is an interesting reading that opens to maybe theology, maybe even to history of religion, if you think about it. The other example I would like to show is one that Paola Mollo brought already. I did not know that she would talk about this bless God, curse God. So Job's wife in 2:9 says to him, do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die. But that's the Hebrew wife of Job, because the Greek wife of Job talks a bit longer. She goes, how long will you persist and say, look, I'll hang on a little longer while I wait for the hope of my deliverance? For look, your legacy has vanished from the earth. Sons and daughters, my womb's birth pangs and labors, for whom I wearied myself with hardships in vain. And you sit in the refuse of forms as you spend the night in the open air. As for me, I am one that wanders about in a hired servant from place to place, house to house, waiting for when the sun will set, so I can rest from the distresses and griefs that now beset me. Now say some word to the Lord and die. Yeah, so here there is a big stress in the suffering, and obviously this doesn't happen by mistake. I mean, someone is writing, working this text literally to say more than what was said, developing this lament, this reprimand of Job's wife. In the apparatus, Robert Althann indicates that there is more happening in the Septuagint. We don't add the whole text in the apparatus, that would be too long, but in the textual commentary, he gives the full text. And what I really like here is that he used the abbreviation lit. That indicates that there is a literary development. So, and this is also where the edition starts with textual criticism, but then opens the way for literary criticism, redactional criticism, and whatever. So this is a very interesting case. In conclusion, the treatment of the Septuagint in the BHQ edition of Job is a challenge because of the particularities of the translation technique of this book. The edition takes into consideration these difficulties and offers the users the information needed for their evaluation, which is very important. Finally, I think we all should thank Robert Althann for all the years, he said here before, 30 years of effort to prepare this edition. That is now an excellent tool for all biblical scholars. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pessoa. So you really brought us deep into the complexity of this work. That it is really both humbling and extremely challenging. So now we turn to another area of Professor Althann's background, ancient Near Eastern studies. And so Professor Soo Hoo's topic, BHQ Job in the context of ancient Near Eastern texts.
So my colleagues started with the Bibel, and I will end with Babel. And hopefully I won't babble on too long. Over 30 years ago, Robert Althann began his work on Biblia Hebraica Quinta's edition of the Book of Job. Today, we celebrate this volume, which finally has seen the light of day in June of this year. Robert Althann is Professor Emeritus of Language and Literature of Ancient Israel at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. He has taught generations of students the intricacies of Aramaic and has inspired in them a deep appreciation of sapiential literature. Still active today at the distinguished age of 85, he serves the Society of Jesus as the secretary to the General's regional assistant for Eastern and Central Europe, with joy, fidelity, and graciousness. Robert, please accept this brief paper on the ancient Near Eastern context of the Book of Job as a sign of our gratitude for your presence and scholarship at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. Anyone who does even a casual perusal of the commentary on the critical apparatus of BHQ's Job will be struck by the numerous references to linguistic parallels with Ugarit in order to explain some of the semantic or grammatical cruxes that are present. Today, I would like to step back and speak about the wider religious and sociocultural context by comparing the Book of Job with some of the other ancient Near Eastern texts that deal with the so-called problem of theodicy. In particular, I will focus my remarks on the tablet RS 25460 from Ugarit, also known as Ugaritica 5, number 162, a prayer to Marduk, which was first published by Jean Neugerol in 1968, but which has been subsequently re-edited and published by Takayoshi Oshima in 2011 in his Babylonian Prayers to Marduk, and more recently by Yoram Cohen in 2013 in Wisdom from the Late Bronze Age. The dating of RS 25460 is still debated, but it certainly must predate the destruction of Ugarit, circa 1190 BCE, and may have had antecedents in the late Old Babylonian period or the early Middle Babylonian period, circa 17th century BCE or later, based on the linguistic and orthographic features. Numerous scholars have noticed the similarity in style and content with Ludlel Bel-Nemeki, Let Me Praise the Lord of Wisdom, which has also been compared to the Book of Job. Yet it is still unknown if it was a direct influence between the Ugaritic prayer to Marduk and Ludlel. The latter is an Akkadian work probably composed in the later part of the second millennium, during the Kassite period, 16th to 12th centuries BCE, and was subsequently re-edited in the early first millennium. The linguistic features, vocabulary, learned paronomasia, and school copies all indicate that Ludlel was an important cultural work in the cuneiform milieu and was part of the scribal curriculum. Moreover, its similarities with RS 25460 suggest that the motif of the righteous sufferer in wisdom literature and lament go back as far as the 13th century BCE, if not earlier, and was known in both Mesopotamia proper as well as the Levant. Unlike Ludlel and Job, the Ugaritic prayer to Marduk has only 46 preserved lines, most of which consists of first-person speech. The beginning and end of this composition, found only at Ugarit, is lost, but enough survives to reconstruct its structure and discern its themes. There are no interlocutors, and the deity does not respond to the sufferer's complaint. About half of the lines describe the speaker's pitiful condition, while the other half is devoted to the praise of Marduk. The composition is divided into two sections by a refrain expressing the speaker's faith in Marduk, which is repeated twice in lines 13' to 16'. The first half of the composition has two sections. Lines 1' to 8' describe the confused omens that cannot be interpreted by various cultic specialists so that the speaker's illness might come to an end. Lines 19' to 12' recount how the speaker's family has gathered in mourning due to his sorry state. Although the second half of the work begins with another account of the speaker's sickness, This time, using the metaphors of hunger and sleeplessness, the rest of the section focuses on reasons for praising Marduk and Marduk's dual nature. This last section consists of 3 statements that express how Marduk is both an angry and merciful god. After the first statement, however, there is a list of 6 ways in which Marduk's destructive acts have affected the speaker. Instead, the last 2 statements are followed by at least 7 ways in which Marduk has healed or has come to the aid of the sufferer. There seems to be an implicit argument in this final part. Marduk helps those who suffer more than he hurts those when they have lost his favor. This repeats the theme that Marduk determines if one lives or prospers, which is first raised in the section providing the reasons for praising Marduk. There are some similarities, but also important differences between the Ugaritic prayer to Marduk and the book of Job, especially in the situation that gives rise to the speaker's lament and the reflection of the role of the deity, because of the conception of reality operative in each text. At the beginning of RS 25-460, the speaker reports his illness, but no cause is given, only the effects. Only in the second half of the composition does the audience learn that his suffering is due to a divine agent, Marduk. Nonetheless, it is never stated why the deity is angry or why the sufferer has lost divine favor. In contrast, Job's travails are attributed to the Lord, who allows the adversary, Hasatan, to have power over this blameless and upright man, who had no reason to fear God, but was fenced around and blessed by God. God's limited knowledge, which ultimately arises because of humanity's free will and not divine anger, is the reason for Job's suffering. Although the Lord wants to find out how Job will respond to suffering, the latter initially refuses to sin or reproach God. Likewise, the sufferer in the Ugaritic composition does not reject his deity because of his dire situation, likened to death itself, because Marduk is free to act and can change his disposition toward his human followers without having to give a reason. Marduk does not need to justify himself before human beings. While later texts like Ludl express it more clearly, Mesopotamian deities have absolute free will and consequently can be capricious. The only recourse for human beings who also have free will is lament and perseverance as they try to modify any improper behavior, consciously chosen or otherwise, and persuade the deities to relent and adopt a more favorable disposition. Job, on the other hand, is being tested in an extraordinary manner, while the sufferer in the Ugaritic prayer to Marduk is just confronting reality as it is, or more precisely, as ancient Mesopotamians conceived it to be. Another area of overlap in these 2 compositions is their rumination on death. In the Ugaritic prayer, the speaker describes how his dire situation leads to his family treating him as if he were dead. This includes a critique of them in lines 9' to 12'. Similar language is found in Ludl Tablet 2 and Tablet 5. All the actions mentioned are associated with funerary rites. Cultic personnel like the Mahu were in the service of Ishtar and were connected with mourning or lamentation. However, in line 43', the speaker praises Marduk for taking the spade from the hand of the one who wished to bury me, which suggests that his family had in fact betrayed him by not supporting him in his hour of need. Divine abandonment is accompanied by disruption of social networks in the human sphere. In response to Zophar the Naamathite, Job's musings on death begin with his acknowledgement that in the Lord's hand is every living soul and the breath of all humanity. As the Mizora Parva of BHQ notes, the phrase Ruach kol betzar ish is rare and only appears in Job 12:10. It is simpler and more specific than P's formulation kol beshar asher bo ruach hayim, all flesh which has the breath of life in it, in Genesis 6:17. With other Mesopotamian literature, the book of Job shares the idea that it is the deity who grants the breath of life to human beings and takes it away when they die. For example, in the section of RS 25-460, providing reasons for praising Marduk, the speaker insists that without Marduk, the breath of my mouth would have departed. There may be wordplay in this line since sharu is used instead of the more common napishtu for breath. There is a homophonous root, sharu, which means to be rich, prosperous. Indeed, Marduk not only provides life, but also prosperity. There is ambiguity regarding the Mesopotamian afterlife, since the dead can still have a type of existence, lingering around as unfed and angry spirits causing trouble to the living. This conception is found in Ludlow 5:31-33, which speaks about the breath being extinguished, resulting in being sent down to the netherworld and becoming a ghost. Even though the sufferer may be at the brink of the grave, the fact that the speaker has left a work praising Marduk so that he may not be forgotten is testimony itself that the God has intervened on his behalf. The development of Job as a character begins with chapter 3, when he curses the day of his birth and provides various reasons for doing so. Noting the injustice in the world, Job wishes that God would hide him in Sheol until this divine anger passes. Although this belief initially brings him comfort because both sinners and the righteous have the same fate in Sheol, Job then becomes hopeless when confronted with the realization that death may be permanent. For example, in Job 14:14, if mortals die, will they live again? Job 15:22-25, or Job 17:13-16. Starting in chapter 14, Job realizes that man is like a flower which blossoms and withers, or like a shadow which does not endure. The days of human beings are numbered and they die, only to awake when the heavens are no more. But Job has no guarantee that God will revive the dead. Whereas the Ugaritic prayer portrays the effects of divine anger as somewhat transitory on the sufferer, the book of Job presents it in something much more definitive way, since God's anger can lead to permanent death. To put it in another way, only the Lord can give life and reward those who have lived righteously, with continued existence after death. But once God has withdrawn the breath of life, all possibilities are extinguished. In contrast, the conclusion of Job highlights the righteous life of its protagonist, who dies at the ripe old age of 140 years, so as to see 4 generations of sons and grandsons. Job is restored and vindicated, while Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite are criticized by God for not having spoken the truth about the Lord. Like the sufferer in the Ugaritic prayer to Marduk, the book of Job critiques the human response to Job's suffering. Instead of acting with compassion or empathy, Job's interlocutors blame him and argue with him. Even though he is angry at the other 3 for their condemnation, even Elihu, the penultimate speaker, is indignant because Job thought himself righteous against God. His argument that God constantly calls human beings to repentance and acts justly is reinforced by the Lord, who replies to Job from the whirlwind, insisting that God's ways are beyond human understanding. Only then does Job relent. Job has received what he was looking for, even though it might not be the answer he initially sought. Job wanted God to justify the suffering he experienced, but God instead responded by revealing God's self in the chaos of the whirlwind, reality, challenging human hubris with the enduring divine presence. There is no condemnation of Job's arguing with the Lord, because sometimes it is in the wrestling, like Jacob and the angel, that we find God. Furthermore, the conclusion of Job's story highlights the importance of solidarity in suffering when his brothers and sisters show him empathy and compassion for the evil that is done to him. Finally, the Mesopotamian texts and the book of Job differ in their anthropology. As this prayer to Marduk from the first millennium demonstrates, Mesopotamian literature has a much more pessimistic fate for human beings. Humans were created to serve the gods. Without them, the deities will suffer from hunger because there would be no one to work the fields and provide offerings to the temples. This do ut des relationship is expressed in an Uninu prayer to Marduk from the old Babylonian period. This divine dependence upon human beings is not found in the book of Job. Instead, Job has the inverse. Human beings depend wholly upon God for life and continued existence after death. Instead of attempting primarily to establish an evolutionary connection in comparison, we come to a better understanding of a topic when we appreciate both similarities and differences. While the numerous surface similarities between the Mesopotamian and biblical sapiential literature are well known, this paper has explored how the differences in the conceptions of the deity, reality, and humanity are manifest in the so-called theodicies in the book of Job and Mesopotamian wisdom literature. Ancient wisdom adopted a holistic approach to various relationships grounded in reality. While wisdom comes in many different forms, it was always rooted in the values, beliefs, and attitudes of a particular culture and reflects how the society views and interprets the world and people's place in it. Ad multos annus, Robert, and many thanks for your wisdom, generosity, and kindness as a colleague, but most importantly, as a friend in the Lord. Like Job, may you live to a contented and ripe old age, and may you be blameless and upright in the sight of God. Amen.
Would you switch places now? Thank you very much, Professor Soo Hoo, for this dive into relocating the Book of Job within its milieu. Now I would like to invite Professor Althann to come up and say a few words. He's the one we've all been waiting to hear. And so, welcome. You can all just stay where you are and go to the chair near the microphone, Robert.
Thank you for your words. Yes, we found that picture. Well, I must begin with words of thanks to Professor Craig Morrison, Dean of the Faculty of Ancient Eastern Studies, who has organized our meeting tonight, and to Professor Peter Dubovský for his kind words. And of course, I have to thank colleagues who spoke this evening. Very interesting, and I'll come back to that a little bit later, but I thank them for their trouble and for having looked at the book. It's not a sort of book that you use for bedside reading. I am indebted to many scholars who have commented on earlier versions of the book, of the text that's now published. To them I offer grateful thanks. And of course, I thank to all of you gathered here this evening, not all specialists in biblical studies, but all interested in the Bible and the work of improving our understanding of the Word of God. I'd like now to mention some who are no longer with us. In the first place, Father Stephen Pisano, who was professor of textual criticism here for many years. It was he who invited me, or suggested to me, I should say, that perhaps I might join this project of the Biblia Hebraica Quinta. Then I would like to mention in particular two professors at the Institute, Dennis McCarthy, and Mitchell Dahoud. McCarthy taught Pentateuch and the historical books from 1969 until his death during the Yosot Congress in Salamanca in 1983. As a matter of interest, he had succeeded Norbert Lorfink, who died in Germany on the 23rd of September this year. McCarthy stressed the need to view the biblical books as works of literature. This, of course, was also emphasized by his colleague, Luis Alonso Schöckl. Mitchell Dahoud was professor at the Institute from 1956 until his death in 1982. He taught Ugaritic, but with much reference to the Hebrew Bible, and he expected students in his classes to participate. Older scholarship tended to solve difficulties in the Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew text, by proposing changes to the consonants suggested by ancient translations. For example, the Old Greek. Georg Forer's commentary on the Book of Job, first published in 1963, reprinted in 1989, contains more than 300 such proposals. Mitchell Dahoud was a Semitist who applied his linguistic skills to elucidating the Hebrew text of the prophetical books, of the book of Proverbs, of Psalms, and of the book of Job. He respected the consonants of the Masoretic text, but in his earlier years treated the Masoretic vowels lightly. This, of course, caused a lot of discussion in the scholarly world. Later, he became more conservative and tried to protect the Masoretic vowels as well. And he did so by taking account of literary practices observed in the Ugaritic texts, though not peculiar to them. And it is Dahoud's later methodology that I have tried to follow. When I was thinking of writing a doctoral thesis, he suggested something from the book of Jeremiah, but he said, look for literary techniques. Make a list of them and see what you can find. And I tried to do that for those 3 chapters of the book of Jeremiah. And I've always been interested in that. Inadequately, I have to say. I have to thank the colleagues here who have given us a very rich perspective on the book of Job, all sorts of things I didn't do, some of which I should have done, but that's how it is. But I can say my main interest in my scholarly work has been, yes, to try and shed light on these difficult texts, in especially the poetical books of the Old Testament, where the very concise Hebrew, it's not always clear how the words relate to each other. I certainly never intended to produce anything definitive, and this edition in the BHQ is very far from being definitive. But it will, I hope, stimulate discussion in the scholarly world and eventually lead, we hope, to better solutions and to a clearer understanding of the Word of God in the book of Job. Thank you.
So here you can see the BHQ Job. It only arrived in the library less than a few months ago, and it's already rather used, so you can see that people are taking it off the shelf, and in a couple of years we're going to need a second volume. I hope what you've also experienced this evening is the warmth among scholars, especially the speakers, and the way Robert's words as well, that we really have to work together as a team, especially in this area. And so you see the teamwork and the reflection and appreciation. I like to say that if there are 10 text critics in a room and a textual problem is presented, you're going to have at least 11 or 12 opinions about the solution. There's going to be a lot of vibrant dialogue. The other thing I wanted to mention, because I worked closely with Robert when he submitted the final work, we had to start going through it. The patience of Job. I know it's a New Testament image, it's not in the book of Job, but he manifested extreme patience and profound humility. And I think you've experienced that this evening. And the result, I think, is a really excellent book as we were discussing different issues, and it was just a really marvelous experience to work with him. So I hope you've enjoyed this evening as we've taken this look into BHQ. I really want to thank the panel. Each one of you, when I wrote to you, immediately said yes, and I suggested titles, you said yes. So I really appreciate the fact you took this time. And again, the warmth with which you expressed your love for the work that we do and for the volume that's been produced. And thank you, Robert, for accepting our invitation. Have a good evening.